The cracked obsidian data slate was warm when they placed it on my lectern. That was the first wrong thing. Slate does not hold heat. It is inert, a dead medium chosen precisely because it resists corruption, resists change, resists the slow entropy that devours parchment and corrodes data crystal. Obsidian is the Imperium's promise to itself that certain records will outlast the stars that witnessed them. It does not warm to the touch. It does not carry the residual temperature of the hands that bore it. But this one did. The courier had departed moments before, an inquisitorial bondsman in sealed void armor who had spoken exactly 11 words during the transfer and whose retinal signature I had verified against the rotating cipher provided at shift commencement. He had placed the slate into the pneumatic transfer cradle, keyed the release, and walked back toward the docking umbilical without ceremony. I heard his mag boots receding down the corridor, each step a dull percussion against the deck plating, and then the blast door cycled shut and I was alone with what he had delivered. Exterminatus extremis. The sigil was unmistakable. Raised gold pressed into the obsidian face, the aquila inverted beneath a burning world, ringed by 19 scriptural citations too small to read without optical magnification, but whose presence alone confirmed the order's provenance. I had seen this sigil 943 times during my career. I had authenticated it, cross-referenced it, transcribed it into the permanent record, and sealed it with the wax of my own office. 943 worlds reduced to entries in the archive. 943 designations that would never again appear on compliance rosters, tithe schedules, or astropathic relay charts. The number should have been staggering. It was not. It was simply the count. I set the slate upon its cradle and aligned it with the lectern's optical reader. My fingers performed the calibration sequence without conscious direction. 41 years of service had made the movements involuntary, the way a heart beats or lungs draw breath. The vault cogitators hummed as they received the initial data burst, their machine spirits cycling from dormancy to active processing, amber runes cascading across the primary display in patterns I could interpret faster than language. Before I read the order, I prayed. The litany of final mercy is not long. 47 words in High Gothic, structured as an invocation, a declaration, and a seal. I had spoken it before every authentication since my investiture, and the words had worn grooves in my memory so deep that they felt less like language and more like respiration. I shaped them now with the same precision I had shaped them at the beginning of every shift for 4 decades. Standing before my lectern in the soft amber light of the archive vault, incense coiling from the bronze censers, mounted at each corner of my station, the air thick with the chemical sweetness of sanctified smoke. By the authority vested in the servants of the Golden Throne, I received this judgment. Let the record show that mercy was sought and mercy was spent. What remains is fire. Let fire be truth. Let truth be eternal. The Imperium endures. I activated the cogitators. The planetary designation scrolled into view. Kalish Tertius, Segmentum Pacificus, Subsector Angorath, Grid Reference Sigma V5I114. Population at last census, 412 million souls. Primary tithe classification, Exactis Tertius, providing refined promethium and light manufactorium output. Compliance grade as of most recent evaluation, Salutio pending. I stopped. Salutio pending is a recovery classification. It indicates a world under remedial governance, a world whose failures have been identified and whose correction is underway. It is not a terminal designation. It is, in fact, one of the more optimistic classifications available, suggesting that the Administratum believes the world can be returned to productive compliance within a standard generation. I knew this classification intimately. I had processed thousands of worlds bearing it, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, Salutio pending resolved into Salutio confirmatus within 10 to 15 standard years. Kalish Tertius should not have been bearing the sigil of exterminatus extremis. I pulled the timestamp. The writ had been generated 14 hours prior, aboard an inquisitorial black ship operating under sealed mandate. The authorizing signatories were 3, an Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor whose cipher I recognized from previous writs, a Lord Militant representative attached to Crusade Command, and a Segmentum-level Administratum Prefect whose seal I had personally verified no fewer than 60 times. All 3 seals were flawless. I checked the planetary record again. My terminal granted me access to the most recent compliance evaluation for Kalesh Tertius, dated 6 weeks prior. Solutio pending. Recovery trajectory positive. Recommended action, continued monitoring with resource allocation review at next quartile. 6 weeks ago, this world was recovering. Now it was condemned. I felt the warmth of the slate against my fingertips, and I authenticated the order. I keyed my personal cipher, applied the Lex Mechanics verification rune, and transmitted the confirmed authorization to the weapons platform in high anchor above Kalesh Tertius. The cogitators logged my action with timestamps precise to the microsecond. The record was made. The order was sealed. Somewhere below the station's orbit, far beyond the reach of my senses or my authority, cyclonic torpedoes were being armed. Within the hour, they would fire. I set the slate aside and reached for the next document in the queue. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. The incense continued to burn. The archive vault hummed with the patient industry of 1,000 active data looms, their mechanical shuttles weaving parchment and data thread into the permanent record of an Imperium that spanned 1,000,000 worlds. 1 fewer. Now, I worked. My name is Vale Octavius Meranthos, Senior Lex Mechanic of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, Ordo Certus, seconded to Archive Station Sigma Meridian, high orbit above the naval fortress world of Bakar in the Segmentum Pacificus. I hold the rank of Prefect Tertius within the Administratum hierarchy, which places me above the common scribes and below the senior prefects who oversee entire subsector archives. My authority is narrow but absolute within its domain. No exterminatus order within my assigned grid references becomes permanent record without my authentication. No world dies, in the formal and eternal sense, without my cipher marking the moment of its passing. I have held this post for 41 standard years. I was inducted at 23, drawn from the Schola Administratum on Hydrafa after demonstrating what my tutors called exceptional tolerance for cognitive dissonance. I did not understand the compliment at the time. I understand it now. The Exterminatus Authorization Bureau occupies a lateral annex of Archive Station Sigma Meridian, a structure that is itself merely one node in the vast network of orbital repositories maintained by the Adeptus Administratum across the Segmentum. The station is ancient. Its original construction date is listed as M37, 412, though structural analysis suggests components of the central spine predate that by at least a millennium. It orbits Bakar at a sufficient distance to avoid the gravitational complexities of the naval yards, a silent presence in the outer system that most of the fortress world's inhabitants have never seen and will never think about. This is by design. The work done here is not secret in the way the Inquisition's work is secret, sealed behind oaths and threats. It is secret in the way that breathing is secret. No one thinks to ask about it. No one wonders who files the documents that authorize the death of worlds. The assumption, if any assumption is made at all, is that such things happen automatically, that the machinery of governance grinds forward without human hands, but hands are required. My hands. The annex itself is a cathedral of filing. There is no other accurate description. The central vault rises 40 meters from floor to vaulted ceiling, its walls lined with archive stacks that ascend in tiers connected by brass-railed gantries and pneumatic lifts. The air is perpetually cool, maintained at a precise temperature to preserve parchment, and carries the layered scent of ink preservative, machine oil, and the ever-present incense that burns from censers shaped like weeping saints. Servo skulls drift between the stacks, their anti-grav motors humming at a frequency just below audible perception, their eye lenses flickering amber as they scan and catalog and recatalogue in an endless cycle of verification. The sound of parchment dominates everything. Not the crisp sound of new sheets being cut and folded, but the continuous whisper of thousands of data looms feeding completed records into storage sleeves, a sound like breathing, like the murmur of a congregation at prayer. It never stops. During the years when I was new to the post, I found the sound comforting. It suggested purpose, industry, a universe being properly recorded and maintained. Now I hear it the way one hears one's own heartbeat during a medical examination, an autonomous function made conspicuous only when attention is drawn to it. My station is the 7th lectern in the western nave of the central vault, positioned between the primary hololithic display bank and the pneumatic transfer system that connects the annex to the station's external docking facilities. The lectern itself is a substantial piece of ironwood and brass, scarred with centuries of use, its surface worn smooth by the hands of Lex mechanics who came before me. A shallow groove has been carved into the wood where countless data slates have been set and retrieved. Set and retrieved, an action repeated so many times that the material itself has memorized the gesture. My cogitator terminal occupies the left wing of the lectern, a hardwired unit with no wireless connectivity, no remote access capability, and no data storage beyond its active processing buffer. Every record I create is transmitted directly to the central archive cogitator and simultaneously to 3 redundant backup systems located in different sections of the station. Nothing I process remains on my terminal after transmission. I am a conduit, not a repository. This is comforting. The records pass through me, not into me. Above my station, carved into the vaulted ceiling in letters 2 meters tall, is the Bureau's founding inscription, "Let no world pass unrecorded, let no judgment pass unsealed." In precision, salvation. I have read these words every day of my career. They are the last thing I see when I raise my eyes from the lectern and the first thing I see when I return from rest cycle. They are carved in the stone of this place and in the architecture of my mind, and they are true. They must be true. If they are not true, then what I have done 943 times is not authentication, it is participation. But precision is salvation. The catechism is clear. I learned the doctrine early. During my years at the Schola, before specialization, I studied the general principles of administratum governance, the tithe grades, the compliance classifications, the escalation protocols that govern imperial response to deviation. Every student learns these things. They are the grammar of the Imperium, the rules by which 1,000,000 worlds are organized into something that functions, however imperfectly, as a civilization. What I learned during specialization was narrower and more terrible. The Exterminatus Authorization Bureau exists because the Imperium acknowledges, formally and doctrinally, that some worlds cannot be saved. Corruption takes root. Heresy metastasizes. Xenos taint becomes irreversible. And when all other instruments have been exhausted, when the Astra Militarum cannot reclaim, when the Adepta Sororitas cannot purify, when even the Adeptas Astartes cannot excise the rot, then the final instrument is deployed. Fire. Not metaphorical fire. Not the fire of faith or the fire of righteous anger. Cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, atmospheric incinerators, weapons designed not to conquer a world but to render it lifeless, to reduce its biosphere to ash and its population to nothing. These weapons exist because the Imperium has determined, through 10,000 years of governance, that there are circumstances in which the death of a world is preferable to its continued existence. This is not cruelty, it is mathematics. A corrupted world that remains in the Imperial ledger is a wound that bleeds resources, a vector for further contamination, a liability that compounds with every passing year. A dead world is a closed account. My instructors at the Bureau taught me this with the same patient certainty with which they taught me formatting protocols and seal verification. Exterminatus is not murder, exterminatus is surgery. The body of the Imperium is vast and complex, and sometimes a limb must be severed to save the whole. The surgeon does not hate the limb, the surgeon does not mourn it. The surgeon simply recognizes that the alternative is worse. I believed this. I believe it still, or I believed it at the beginning of this shift, when the cracked obsidian slate was warm in my hands, and the designation Kalesh Tertius scrolled across my display, and the litany of final mercy felt true. Now the shift continues, and there is work to be done. The queue held 14 additional writs when I turned from Kalesh Tertius to examine the roster. 14 was not unusual for a Crusade year cycle. Standard operational tempo during peacetime generated between 3 and 7 writs per rotation. During declared crusades, when fleet movements accelerated and strategic calculations shifted to accommodate the logistics of interstellar war, the volume increased. The Imperium was engaged in the Macarian Resurgence Crusade, a multi-sector campaign that had been declared 18 months prior and had already consumed the attention of 4 Lord Militants and the full strategic apparatus of Segmentum Command. Crusade. Years were demanding. Resources were redirected. Priorities were recalculated. Worlds that had been marginal in peacetime became critical during mobilization, and worlds that had been critical could become expendable if their strategic value diminished relative to the Crusade's needs. I understood this in the abstract. I had processed Crusade-era writs before, during the tail end of the Sabbat Worlds campaign and during 2 lesser declarations that had briefly elevated processing volumes. The mathematics were familiar. The doctrine was clear. During Crusade, the Imperium demanded efficiency, delay cost lives, hesitation cost fleets, and the bureaucratic apparatus that supported the war effort was expected to match the tempo of the armies it served. I processed the first 3 writs without incident. Standard authorizations, standard seals. 2 worlds in the Angorath subsector, 1 in the neighboring Caradryad reach. Threat classifications were clear. 1 demonic incursion confirmed by Ordo Malleus, 1 Genestealer cult infestation verified by Ordo Xenos, 1 feral orc ecosystem that had resisted 3 successive Imperial Guard campaigns. These were the clean cases, the writs that required no interpretation, no hesitation. The enemy was named. The evidence was attached. The progression from compliance failure to terminal sanction was documented across hundreds of pages of supporting material, each page bearing the appropriate seals and countersignatures. I authenticated them with the precision of long practice. Verify seals, cross-reference sector threat levels, confirm inquisitorial authority chains, transcribe into permanent archive, apply personal cipher, transmit. 3 worlds, confirmed. The servo skulls drifted overhead, their eye lenses recording my keystrokes. The data looms wove the new records into the archive. The incense burned. I was reaching for the 4th writ when I heard the blast door cycle open at the far end of the nave. The sound was distinctive. Archive Station Sigma Meridian operated with minimal foot traffic during active processing shifts. The annex was staffed by 17 Lex mechanics, 4 senior prefects, approximately 90 junior adepts and scribe servitors, and a rotating complement of security personnel drawn from the station's internal garrison. During a standard shift, movement through the central vault was limited to the junior adepts delivering physical documents and the servo skulls performing their endless cataloging runs. The blast doors opened only for arrivals from outside the annex, supply deliveries, courier transfers, or inspections. This was an inspection. I knew it before I saw the figure emerge from the corridor. The quality of the silence changed. The junior adepts at their scribing stations straightened imperceptibly. The servo skulls altered their patrol patterns, drifting toward the periphery of the vault as if drawn by an invisible current. Even the data looms seemed to quiet, their rhythmic whisper softening by a degree that should have been imperceptible but was not. The interrogator walked with the unhurried precision of someone who had never been required to justify their pace. She was tall, lean, clad in a long coat of black leather that had been treated to a matte finish, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The inquisitorial rosette hung at her throat on a chain of blackened adamantium, its surface polished to a dull gleam that drew the eye and held it. Her face was angular, severe, framed by hair cropped close to the skull in the utilitarian style common among inquisitorial operatives. She carried no visible weapon, which meant the weapons she carried were invisible and therefore more concerning. She stopped 3 meters from my lectern and regarded me with the patient stillness of a predator that has already calculated the distance and the angle and the effort required. Senior Lex Mechanic Merenthos. Interrogator. I am Interrogator Sevrain, attached to Lord Inquisitor Gal's command staff for the duration of the Macharian resurgence. She produced a data wafer from her coat and placed it on my lectern. Crusade Command has identified throughput inefficiencies in the authorization pipeline for subsectors Angorath, Caradryad, and Mortian's Reach. I have been assigned to streamline processing at this node. I examined the data wafer. Its seals were immaculate. The authorization bore the cipher of Lord Inquisitor Gal, a name I recognized from 7 previous writs and whose authority was confirmed in the Bureau's master ledger. The mandate was straightforward: review current processing protocols, identify inefficiencies, and implement corrections to achieve a minimum 17% increase in throughput velocity. 17%. That number was specific, not a general improvement target, but a calculated figure derived from operational requirements. Someone at Crusade Command had determined that the current rate of Exterminatus authorization was insufficient for the campaign's logistical needs, and they had quantified the deficit with precision. How may I assist the Inquisition's mandate, Interrogator? By continuing your work exactly as you have been, Sevrain said, with one procedural adjustment. Secondary cross-referencing against historical compliance records is to be suspended for the duration of the crusade. Fleet coordination windows do not accommodate retrospective verification. All writs bearing proper inquisitorial seals are to be authenticated on primary verification alone. I processed the instruction. Secondary cross-referencing was the step I performed when a writ's planetary data did not align with the most recent compliance evaluation in the archive. It was the step that would have flagged Kalish Tertius as an anomaly. It was the step that required me to check whether a world had been previously classified as recoverable before authenticating its destruction. Interrogator. Secondary cross-referencing is a standard Bureau protocol established under Administratum Directive 7712. Its suspension would require countersignature from a senior prefect. Sevrain's expression did not change. She reached into her coat again and produced a second data wafer, which she placed beside the first. Senior Prefect Halvan has already countersigned, as has the station commander. The directive has been amended for the duration of the declared crusade. You will find the amended text in the wafer's secondary partition. I read the amendment. It was properly formatted, properly sealed, properly authored. The language was clear and unambiguous. Secondary cross-referencing was suspended. Primary verification was sufficient. Throughput was to increase. Understood, Interrogator. Exemplary. She turned as if to leave, then paused. Lex Mechanic. The crusade requires sacrifice from all servants of the throne. The soldiers sacrifice their bodies. The generals sacrifice their sleep. We sacrifice our hesitation. Every hour of delay in this office is an hour in which a corrupted world continues to contaminate its neighbors. You are not destroying worlds, Merenthos. You are protecting the ones that remain." She left. The blast door sealed behind her. The vault's ambient sound returned to its baseline hum. I looked at the amended directive on my lectern. I looked at the queue of writs awaiting authentication. I set the directive aside and reached for the next slate. There was no reason to hesitate. The seals were correct. The authority was confirmed. The amendment was lawful. I worked faster. The hours accumulated in the way they always did during extended shifts, not as a linear progression but as a thickening, a gradual increase in weight that settled into the bones and the eyes and the joints of the fingers. The archive vault had no windows. There was no exterior reference for the passage of time, no shift in light or temperature to mark the movement from one watch to the next. Only the chronometer mounted above the primary display bank, its brass hands turning with mechanical indifference, marking the hours of a 36 rotation that had been mandated by the Crusade's operational requirements. By the 8th hour, I had authenticated 11 writs. The pace was notably faster than my standard output. Without secondary cross-referencing, each authentication cycle was reduced by approximately 9 minutes, a savings that compounded across the queue and produced the efficiency gains that Interrogator Sovereign's mandate required. I felt the improvement as a kind of clarity, a streamlining of the cognitive process that accompanied the streamlining of the bureaucratic one. Fewer steps meant fewer opportunities for the mind to wander, fewer moments in which doubt could intrude between intention and action. The rhythm was clean: receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. Receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. It felt like obedience. I was deep in that rhythm when the junior adept approached my lectern. His name was Tessio. He was young, 26 or 27, with the soft features and ink-stained fingers of someone who had spent his entire career in the archive. He served as my secondary runner, delivering physical documents from the pneumatic system to my station and returning completed files to the archive stacks. He was efficient, quiet, and displayed the appropriate deference for someone of his rank addressing a senior Lex mechanic. He was also visibly unsettled. Senior Lex mechanic, there is a queue anomaly in the processing buffer. Define the anomaly. 3 exterminatus writs from separate subsectors, Angarath, Caradryad, and the Morchan periphery, have been reclassified within the same processing hour. All 3 were previously flagged as Solutio pending or equivalent recovery designations. All 3 are now flagged as irrecoverable, extremis mandated. He placed the summary printout on my lectern. The hololithic display behind him was alive with red sigils, priority markers that pulsed like open wounds across the subsector map. 3 worlds, spread across 3 subsectors, all reclassified simultaneously, all now bearing the marks of terminal sanction. I examined the printout. The reclassification authority was uniform across all 3 writs: Crusade Command, Strategic Logistics Division, countersigned by Inquisitorial Mandate. The seals were genuine. The timestamps were sequential, each reclassification issued within minutes of the others, suggesting a single decision point propagated through multiple channels. This is not anomalous, Tessio. It is a coordinated strategic reclassification. Crusade Command has determined that these worlds no longer meet viability thresholds under wartime conditions. Yes, Senior Lex Mechanic, but the reclassification data does not include supporting documentation. Normally, a change from Solutio pending to irrecoverable would be accompanied by a threat assessment addendum, a resource evaluation summary, and a compliance trajectory analysis. These writs contain only the reclassification order and the exterminatus authorization. I looked at the printout again. He was correct. The supporting documentation was absent. Under standard protocol, this would have triggered a secondary review request, a formal query to the issuing authority requesting the missing materials before authentication could proceed. Under the amended protocol, secondary review was suspended. The amended directive supersedes standard documentation requirements during Crusade operations. Primary verification is sufficient. If the seals are genuine and the authority chain is confirmed, authenticate. Tessio hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely perceptible, a fraction of a second in which his lips parted as if to speak and then closed again. He nodded, collected the printout, and returned to his station. I authenticated the 3 writs. The red sigils on the hololithic display transitioned from blinking urgency to steady confirmation. 3 worlds, condemned. The data looms began their work, weaving the new records into the permanent archive. Receive. Verify. Authenticate. Transmit. The incense was thick enough now to taste, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of the throat and lingered in the sinuses. I had not noticed its accumulation, but the sensors had been burning continuously since the shift began, and the ventilation systems in the annex were designed for preservation, not comfort. The air recycled slowly, deliberately, maintaining the cool temperature required by the archives while allowing the sacred smoke to permeate every surface. It was meant to sanctify the work, to remind those who served here that their labor was not mere administration but a form of worship, a contribution to the Imperium's eternal record. I breathed it in and continued. The 12th hour brought the confirmation protocols. This was the part of the duty I had never been able to mechanize in my mind, the step that resisted the rhythm of receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. After a writ was authenticated and transmitted, the weapons platforms in high anchor above the condemned world required a confirmation window before deployment. During this window, the archive station received a final burst of data from the planet's remaining communication infrastructure. Astropathic transmissions, Vox broadcasts, automated distress beacons, and any other signals that the dying world cast into the void in its final hours. Protocol required that I monitor these transmissions, not to evaluate them, not to act upon them, simply to record their existence and note the moment they ceased. The cessation of all planetary communications was the formal confirmation of successful exterminatus. When the signals stopped, the world was dead. I recorded the time of death and sealed the record. I had performed this task 943 times. The transmissions were always the same in their variety. Panicked military vox, garbled civilian broadcasts, the shrieking static of astropaths overwhelmed by proximity to mass death. Occasionally there were structured transmissions, final reports from planetary commanders or governors who understood what was happening and chose to spend their remaining minutes composing formal accounts for the record. These were the most difficult to process, not because of their content but because of their format. They were structured like the documents I worked with every day, properly formatted and properly sealed, as if the act of maintaining bureaucratic precision in the face of annihilation was itself a form of prayer. I activated the Auspex feeds for Kalesh Tertius. The cathedral-sized display bank behind my lectern came alive with waveform data, multiple channels of communication stacked in descending order of signal strength. The primary feed was military vox, encrypted but decaying as the planetary defense network fragmented under the preliminary bombardment. The secondary feeds carried civilian broadcasts, most already reduced to static, a few still transmitting coherent audio. I listened. The first voice was male, middle-aged, speaking in the clipped cadence of a mid-rank military officer. His words were fragmented by interference, but the content was clear enough. He was reporting to someone, anyone, that the bombardment had begun, that the planetary governor had declared emergency protocols, that evacuation transports had been denied clearance by the naval cordon, that they were trapped. The second voice was female, younger, and she was praying. Not the formal prayers of the Imperial Creed, but something older, regional, a devotion specific to Kalesh Tertius that I did not recognize. The words were soft and rhythmic, a counterpoint to the harsh static that surrounded them, and they continued without interruption for several minutes before the feed cut to silence. The third voice was the planetary governor. He was transmitting on an open channel, his words clear and deliberate, and he was not panicking. He was filing an appeal. "This is Governor Prelate Aldan Voss of Kalesh Tertius, transmitting on open administratum frequency under Emergency Protocol Sigma 9. I have submitted formal appeal against Exterminatus sanction through the Astropathic Choir at Relay Station Angarath 7, appeal reference number Kappa, Tertius 1144, Voss. I have received acknowledgement of receipt from the relay station. I repeat, acknowledgement has been received. The appeal is on record. I am requesting immediate suspension of hostilities pending review." I paused the feed. Appeal reference number Kappa, Tertius 1144, Voss. Acknowledgement received. The appeal was filed and logged. Under Standard Administratum Protocol, a filed and acknowledged appeal against Exterminatus triggered an automatic 60-hour suspension of sanction pending review by the issuing authority. This was not a courtesy. It was law. Administratum Directive 391, ratified in the 34th millennium and never amended. I checked the archive for appeal, reference Kappa, Tertius 1144, Voss. There was no record. I searched again, broadening the parameters. No record of any appeal filed by Governor Prelate Aldan Voss. No record of any appeal filed from Kalesh Tertius. No record of any appeal acknowledged by Relay Station Angarath 7 for any world in the current processing queue. The archive was empty. I listened to the governor's transmission again. His voice was calm, professional. He cited the reference number with precision. He stated that acknowledgement had been received. He was not guessing. He was not hoping. He was reporting a fact, a bureaucratic fact, the kind of fact that I processed every day, and the archive contained no trace of it. I reached for the query terminal. My fingers hovered over the input keys. The amended directive was clear. Secondary cross-referencing was suspended. Searching for historical records outside the active processing buffer was, by definition, a secondary verification action. The interrogator had been explicit. The amendment was lawful. My role was primary authentication and confirmation monitoring, not retrospective investigation. I withdrew my hand. The governor's transmission continued for another 4 minutes. He repeated the appeal reference number 3 times. He cited Directive 391. He requested that the commanding officer of the Naval Cordon verify the appeal's existence with Relay Station Angarath 7. Then the feed dissolved into static, and the static dissolved into silence, and the silence was the silence of a world that no longer transmitted anything at all. I recorded the cessation of planetary communications at 14 hours 47 minutes and 22 seconds station time. I marked Kalesh Tertius as complete in the archive. The data looms wove the record into permanence. Complete. The word sat in my mind like a stone in still water. Complete. The word implied culmination, the successful conclusion of a process initiated, evaluated, and executed with proper authority. Complete suggested that everything that needed to happen had happened, that no steps were skipped, no voices unheard. I thought of the governor's calm voice citing an appeal number that did not exist in my archive. I thought of the acknowledgement he claimed to have received. I thought of the 60-hour suspension that should have followed, the review that should have been triggered, the process that should have intervened between the order and the fire. Then I set the thought aside and reached for the next writ in the queue. There were still 22 hours remaining in the shift. The lower archive tiers were not meant for extended habitation. They occupied the ventral sections of the station, far below the cathedral vaults of the central processing annex. In regions where the artificial gravity fluctuated slightly and the temperature dropped below the preservation threshold that the upper levels maintained with such care. The corridors were narrow, poorly lit by flickering lumens that had not been serviced in years, and the air carried a mineral staleness that suggested the atmospheric processes in this section had been deprioritized in favor of more critical systems. I descended during what should have been my first rest interval, the 4-hour break mandated by bureau regulations for lex mechanics on extended shifts. I had told the duty scribe that I intended to use the rest period for personal meditation, a common practice that attracted no attention. Instead, I took the secondary lift to sub-level Gamma 7 and walked into the cold. I cannot adequately explain why I went. The amended directive had removed my obligation to cross-reference. The interrogator's authority was absolute. The seals on every writ I had processed were genuine, the authorization chains confirmed, the formatting immaculate. There was no procedural reason to investigate further. My role was authentication, not adjudication. I was a conduit, not a judge, but the governor's voice followed me. The appeal reference number followed me. The empty archive where a record should have existed followed me. Sub-level Gamma 7 housed the deep archive, the long-term storage vaults where records older than 10 standard years were deposited after their active processing cycles concluded. The physical infrastructure was ancient, predating my tenure by centuries. The cogitator banks that lined the corridors were massive, blocky units encased in adamantium housings that had oxidized to a dark green patina. Frost gathered on their surfaces, condensation from the temperature differential between their internal processing cores and the frigid ambient air. Several units were visibly inactive, their status runes dark, their machine spirits either dormant or dead. Between the cogitator banks, the walls were lined with physical archive stacks, thousands of Plastec storage cases containing parchment copies of records deemed too important for purely digital preservation. The dust was thick. My footsteps left visible impressions on the deck plating. No one had walked this corridor in a considerable time. I found a functioning terminal in the third alcove, a secondary access point that connected to the Deep Archive's cogitator network through a hardwired relay. The terminal was old, its interface sluggish, its display flickering with the effort of maintaining coherent output. I entered my credentials and waited while the machine spirit processed the request, amber runes cycling with agonizing slowness. I searched for Kalesh Tertius. The Deep Archive contained 3 records. The first was a compliance evaluation from 9 years prior, classifying the world as Exactis Secundus, a healthy and productive imperial holding. The second was an updated evaluation from 4 years prior, noting a decline in promethium output and recommending increased oversight. The classification was adjusted to Salutio pending. The third was a remediation report from 6 weeks ago, confirming that corrective measures were underway and projecting a return to Exactis compliance within 10 standard years. 3 records, all consistent, all indicating a world in recovery, not a world in terminal decline. None containing any reference to heresy, Xenos contamination, demonic incursion, or any other threat classification that would warrant exterminatus. I searched for the reclassification order that had changed Kalesh Tertius from Salutio pending to irrecoverable. The Deep Archive did not contain it. The reclassification existed only in the active processing buffer, the current cycle's working memory, with no historical trace in the permanent record. I searched for the 3 worlds that Tessio had flagged, the simultaneous reclassifications. The Deep Archive told the same story. Each world had a compliance history consistent with recovery or stability. Each had been reclassified in the current cycle without any supporting documentation in the permanent record. Then I found the 4th record. It was not a record I had searched for. It appeared as a cross-reference result, a tangential link generated by the Deep Archive's associative search algorithms. The record pertained to a world called Veradan Quintus, subsector Caradriad, which had been subjected to exterminatus 11 months prior. I remembered processing the writ. The threat classification had been demonic incursion, confirmed by Ordo Malleus. The supporting documentation had been extensive and unambiguous. The deep archive contained 2 records for Veridaean Quintus. One matched the writ I had processed. Irrecoverable. Demonic incursion confirmed. The other, filed 3 months before the exterminator's order, classified the world as reclamation successful, with a compliance trajectory that had been approved by the subsector prefect and countersigned by the Administratum's own evaluation board. Both records bore valid seals. I stared at the screen. The frost on the cogitator housing crept across the metal in patterns that resembled script, delicate and illegible. My fingers were numb from the cold, the tips white where they rested against the terminal's input keys. The dust I had disturbed in my passage drifted in the faint air currents, catching the intermittent light of the flickering lumens. 2 records for the same world, one saying it was saved, one saying it was damned, both sealed, both valid, both filed within the same archive, occupying adjacent storage nodes, coexisting without acknowledgement of their mutual contradiction. The deep archive was not corrupted. Corruption would produce errors, garbled data, missing fields. These records were complete and properly formatted. They simply disagreed. I closed the terminal. I stood in the cold corridor surrounded by dead cogitators and ancient parchment and the frozen breath of an archive that had been recording the Imperium's judgments for millennia. I stood there and I felt the weight of the dust on my shoulders, on my hands, in my lungs. I returned to the lift. I ascended to the central vault. I resumed my station. I locked sub-level Gamma 7 from further inquiry, using my Prefect Tertius access codes. The lock was discretionary, the kind of administrative restriction that senior Lex mechanics were authorized to apply to prevent unauthorized adept access to sensitive materials. No one would question it. No one would notice. The records remained where they were, contradicting each other in silence. In the cold, in the dark, I continued to work. The 16th hour brought the Vox feeds for the 3 simultaneously reclassified worlds. I monitored them as protocol demanded, recording the transmissions and noting the moment each world's communications ceased. The feeds were similar to Kalesh Tertius in their general character: military Vox fragmenting under bombardment, civilian broadcasts dissolving into static, astropathic signals shearing apart as the psychic resonance of mass extinction overwhelmed the choir networks. One of the worlds, a Forge auxiliary called Cranthon Minoris, transmitted a structured final report from its Planetary Defense Force commander. The report was concise, professional, and included a formal notation that an appeal had been filed through proper channels and acknowledged by the relay network. I did not search for the appeal. I recorded the transmission. I marked the world as complete. The data looms wove the record. The next world's feeds were more chaotic. Multiple transmissions overlapped, civilian and military, the voices blending into a wall of sound that the Auspex systems struggled to separate into discrete channels. I caught fragments: a woman screaming a child's name, a soldier reciting unit designations as if maintaining military protocol could impose order on the moment of extinction, an automated emergency beacon cycling through its pre-programmed distress signal with mechanical indifference. The sounds layered and merged and became something that was not individual voices anymore but a single sound, the sound of a world ending, dense and shapeless and total. I recorded it. I marked it complete. The third world was silent. Its communications had already ceased by the time my monitoring feeds activated. The Auspex showed nothing but the background radiation of empty frequencies. The world was already dead. Someone had processed the confirmation before the feeds reached my station. I marked it complete anyway. For the record, 20 hours in, 16 to go. The chronometer above the display bank marked the hours with precise indifference, its brass hands sweeping through their circuit, and I began to feel the shift in my body as well as my mind. The fatigue arrived not as a sudden onset, but as a gradual diminishment, a reduction of resolution in all senses. My vision softened at the edges, the sharp lines of the data looms and archive stacks losing definition. My hearing narrowed, filtering out the ambient whisper of the vault until only the sounds immediately relevant to my task remained. The click of input keys, the hum of the cogitator, the soft chime that accompanied each successful authentication. I ate. The nutrient paste was dispensed from a wall unit beside my lectern, a standard-issue administratum ration that provided optimal caloric and nutritional support for extended cognitive labor. Its taste was a faint metallic sweetness that lingered on the tongue and coated the throat. I consumed it standing, as regulations required, unwilling to leave my station for the refectory. The paste provided energy without satisfaction, sustenance without pleasure. It was fuel, nothing more. My hands trembled slightly as I returned to the lectern. The tremor was minor, barely visible, a consequence of the stimulant compounds embedded in the nutrient paste interacting with the fatigue toxins accumulating in my musculature. I flexed my fingers and the tremor subsided. It would return. I authenticated 4 more writs. The seals were genuine. The authority chains were confirmed. The format was correct. I did not cross-reference. I did not hesitate. The paste sat heavy in my stomach, and the incense coated my sinuses, and my eyes burned from 20 hours of staring at hololithic displays, and the chronometer continued its indifferent circuit. Tessio appeared at my lectern again during the 22nd hour. He looked worse than I felt. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, his hands clenched at his sides as if restraining some physical impulse. He placed a data wafer on my lectern without his customary deference, and spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled, but carried an undertone I recognized. It was the sound of someone who had found something they wished they had not. Senior Lex Mechanic, I have identified a documentation anomaly that I believe requires your attention. Proceed. Several writs in the current processing queue reference appeal dispositions for the condemned worlds. In each case, the appeal status is listed as no appeal filed. However, when I attempted to verify this through the relay confirmation archives, the system returned a different status for each world. He paused. I waited. The relay archives show that appeals were filed for 7 of the 12 worlds processed in this shift. Each appeal was acknowledged. Each should have triggered a 60-hour suspension under Directive 391, but the writ processing system shows no record of any appeal. The relay archives and the writ system disagree. What status does the relay archive show? Redacted for strategic cohesion. I looked at the data wafer. The phrase was displayed in the standard administrative typeface, occupying the field where the appeal disposition should have been, replacing the detailed record of filing, acknowledgement, and review that Directive 391 required. Redacted for strategic cohesion. 5 words that erased the existence of formal petitions for clemency, of legal processes invoked by planetary governors and military commanders who had followed every protocol available to them. Appeals existed. Now they did not. Tessio, Senior Lex Mechanic. The amended directive suspends secondary cross-referencing. Relay archive queries fall under secondary verification protocols. You have accessed records outside your authorized scope. His face went blank. The undertone vanished from his voice, replaced by something flatter. I was not aware of the amendment, Senior Lex Mechanic. I will cease the queries immediately. See that you do. Return to your station. He left. I watched him go, a young man with ink-stained fingers and bloodshot eyes walking back to his scribing desk at the far end of the nave, and I wondered if he would continue to look. I wondered if the knowledge he had gathered would sit in his mind the way it sat in mine, heavy and inert and impossible to set down. I wondered if he understood that what he had found was not an error but a feature. The system was not malfunctioning. The system was performing exactly as designed, and the design included the erasure of inconvenient legal processes when those processes threatened operational efficiency. I signed another writ. I knew now that the appeal had been real. Governor Prelate Aldan Voss of Kalesh Tertius had filed his appeal through proper channels. It had been acknowledged, it had been logged, and then it had been redacted, removed, erased from the record as if it had never existed, and the destruction of his world had proceeded without the 60-hour suspension that the law required. I knew this, and I signed another writ. The knowledge did not change my actions. It could not change my actions. The seals were genuine, the authority was confirmed, the amendment was lawful. My role was authentication, not adjudication. I was a conduit. But a conduit that knows what flows through it is no longer merely a conduit. It is a participant. I understood this with the same clarity with which I understood formatting protocols and seal verification. I was not simply processing orders. I was enabling a system that destroyed worlds for reasons that had nothing to do with heresy or corruption or Xenos taint. The words on the writ said, irrecoverable. The record said, recoverable. The seals said, lawful. The redactions said, silenced. And I continued to process, because the alternative was unthinkable. I will not say that I doubted the Imperium. I was not capable of doubting the Imperium. The Imperium was the context within which doubt itself existed, the framework that defined what could be questioned and what could not. One does not doubt the air one breathes. One does not question the gravity that holds one to the deck. The Imperium was the architecture of reality, and my doubt, if it could be called doubt, was not directed at the structure but at my own comprehension of it. Perhaps the system was correct. Perhaps the worlds I had flagged as contradictions were genuinely irrecoverable, and the older records were simply outdated. Perhaps the reclassifications reflected intelligence that I was not cleared to access. Perhaps the redacted appeals were redacted for valid strategic reasons that transcended my understanding. The Imperium was vast, incalculably vast, and the chain of decision-making that connected a single exterminatus order to the strategic needs of a multi-sector crusade passed through so many hands and so many levels of authority that no individual participant could comprehend the whole. Perhaps I was seeing patterns that were not patterns. Perhaps, the 25th hour. I had been awake for over a standard day. The nutrient paste sustained my body. The stimulant sustained my cognition, but beneath the chemical support, the biological substrate was degrading. My vision flickered at the periphery, brief moments of darkness at the edges that might have been fatigue or might have been the lumens in the vault fluctuating. My thoughts moved through increasingly narrow channels, each one sharply defined but disconnected from its neighbors, like corridors in a hive city that had been sealed off during a containment protocol. I was reviewing Crusade resource projections. This was not part of my authentication duties. It was, technically, a secondary reference action that the amended directive prohibited. But the projections were displayed on the hololithic bank as part of the standard situational awareness feed that all senior Lex mechanics were expected to monitor during Crusade operations. I had not searched for the data. It was simply there, scrolling across the display in columns of figures that represented fleet dispositions, supply chain allocations, tithe projections, and operational expenditures. I read the columns because my eyes were drawn to them the way one's eyes are drawn to a wound. The pattern was not hidden. It was not encoded or encrypted or concealed behind classification barriers. It was presented openly, in standard administratum notation, available to anyone with the clearance to access the situational awareness feed. Worlds marked as economically inefficient during Crusade mobilization were disproportionately condemned. The correlation was precise. I could see it in the numbers, in the relationship between tithe shortfalls and reclassification orders, between supply chain bottlenecks and exterminatus authorizations. Worlds that could not meet wartime tithe demands were reclassified. Worlds whose reclamation costs exceeded their projected yield were condemned. Worlds on the periphery of fleet supply corridors, too far to support, too small to matter, too weak to resist, were destroyed. Not because they were heretical, not because they were corrupted, not because they harbored Xenos or daemons or any of the existential threats that exterminatus doctrine was designed to address, because they were expensive. The system was not malfunctioning, it was optimizing. The crusade required resources, and resources were finite, and every world that consumed more than it produced was a liability that could be eliminated with a single writ bearing the proper seals and the proper signatures and the proper format, and the records could be adjusted to justify the elimination retroactively, compliance histories rewritten, threat classifications inflated, appeals redacted, all within the bounds of lawful authority, all with the proper seals. The Imperium did not err. The Imperium adjusted. I sat at my lectern and stared at the columns of figures, and I understood with a clarity that felt like falling. Exterminatus was not the final instrument. It was not the last resort reserved for corruption so absolute that only fire remained. It was a logistical tool, a cost-saving measure, a line item in a crusade budget that someone at Segmentum Command had calculated and approved and transmitted through the proper channels to the proper authorities, who had applied the proper seals and sent the proper writs to my lectern, where I had authenticated them with my personal cipher and transmitted them to the weapons platforms that had fired the cyclonic torpedoes that had killed 412 million people on Kalash Tertius alone. I closed my eyes. The columns of figures persisted behind my eyelids, burned into my retina by hours of exposure, a pattern of numbers that described the death of worlds in the language of accountancy. I opened my eyes. I reached for the next writ. I did not tell anyone. I did not file a report. I did not contact Tessio or any other adept. I did not attempt to reach the senior prefects or the station commander or any authority that might have been capable of intervening, even if intervention were possible, which it was not. I knew what happens to those who question the system. The system is not unkind. It does not punish dissenters with violence or imprisonment. It simply reclassifies them, the same way it reclassifies worlds. I worked. I tried to speak to Karst. She was the Lex mechanic at the 6th Lecton, the station adjacent to mine, a woman I had worked alongside for 11 years. We had never been friends. Friendship was not a concept that the Bureau encouraged or even recognized. But we had developed the kind of professional familiarity that arises from prolonged proximity, the ability to anticipate each other's needs during high-volume processing cycles, to cover each other's stations during rest intervals, to exchange the minimal courtesies that made the endless hours in the vault marginally less oppressive. Her lectern was empty. I asked the duty scribe where Karst had been assigned. The scribe checked his roster and informed me that Lex Mechanic Karst had been reassigned to Archive Station Theta Primus in the Segmentum Solar, effective immediately. No further details were available. Her transfer had been processed during the current shift cycle. Karst had been at Sigma Meridian for 14 years. She had never mentioned a transfer request. She had never expressed any desire to leave the Pacificus. Her entire career, her specialization, her institutional knowledge, all of it was rooted in this station, in this annex, in the subsector grid that she had authenticated for longer than I had. She was gone. The lectern was clean, wiped of any personal items, the surface polished to the same scarred smoothness as every other lectern in the nave. No trace of her remained. I did not ask further questions. The servo skulls continued their patrol. The data looms continued their weaving. The incense continued to burn. The vault was complete and uninterrupted, and the absence of one Lex mechanic was absorbed into its vastness the way a single drop of water is absorbed into the ocean. I stopped looking for allies after that. It was not a decision I made consciously. It was more like the closing of a door that I had not realized was open. The impulse to share what I knew, to find confirmation in another person's awareness, to anchor my understanding in something outside my own mind, that impulse simply faded. It was replaced by a silence that was not peaceful but practical. The silence of a man who understands that the walls have ears, and the ears have masters, and the masters have the authority to reclassify anything, including him. I worked alone. I had always worked alone. The Bureau was structured to ensure it. Each Lex mechanic operated from an individual station, processing an individual queue, applying an individual cipher. The work did not require collaboration. The architecture of the vault, its soaring height, its echoing emptiness, its rows of isolated lecterns separated by meters of open space, all of it was designed to produce exactly this condition. Isolation within proximity, solitude within community. Each servant of the Bureau a closed system, receiving inputs and producing outputs but never connecting to the parallel processes running at adjacent stations. The system was not cruel. It was efficient. The 28th hour brought a discovery I had not sought and could not ignore. I was performing routine archive maintenance, a standard duty during the final quarter of an extended shift, verifying that completed records had been properly integrated into the permanent archive. The process was automated, requiring only cursory oversight, but Bureau protocol mandated that a senior Lex mechanic personally verify a random sample of completed entries to ensure data integrity. The random sample included an older catechism text, a doctrinal reference embedded in the footer of a completed exterminatus record from 3 years prior. The Catechism was a standard Bureau document, one of the foundational texts that defined the theological framework for the work we performed. I had memorized it during my induction. I could recite it from memory. The version in the record did not match my memory. The difference was subtle. A single phrase in the third passage. The version I had memorized read, "Mercy is the foundation of judgment, and judgment the instrument of mercy. Let no world be condemned that might yet be redeemed." The version in the archived record read, "Efficiency is the foundation of judgment, and judgment the instrument of the throne. Let no world remain that cannot serve." I searched for the original catechism in the deep archive. The access to sub-level Gamma 7 was still locked under my discretionary restriction, but the catechism text existed in multiple copies throughout the archive system. I found 3 versions. The oldest, dated from the Bureau's founding charter, matched my memory. The intermediate version, dated from 60 years prior, contained the same text with minor linguistic adjustments. The current version, marked as updated during the present Crusade year, contained the altered phrase. The Catechism had been rewritten, not amended, not revised with transparent notation of changes, as proper doctrinal modification required. Rewritten, the old text replaced by the new text backdated and propagated through the archive as if it had always existed. The doctrinal foundation of the Bureau's purpose, the theological argument that exterminatus was mercy and not murder, had been quietly altered to remove the concept of redemption entirely and replace it with a doctrine of utility. Let no world remain that cannot serve. The ink layers on the oldest physical copies were visible under magnification, the scraped remnants of the original text preserved beneath the overwritten lines. Someone had taken the time to alter even the parchment copies, to physically amend the ancient records, so that the doctrinal change appeared continuous and unbroken. It was meticulous work, thorough, professional. I sat in the cold light of my terminal, and I understood that the belief I had carried for 41 years was not the belief the Bureau currently taught. My faith was an artifact, a relic of a doctrine that the institution had outgrown and discarded, replacing mercy with efficiency, redemption with utility, judgment with logistics. The catechism I had memorized was dead. The words still existed in my mind, but the mind that had written them was gone, and the institution that had adopted them had moved on. The Imperium did not err. It adapted. And it adapted its justifications as readily as it adapted its strategies, rewriting the past to support the present, altering doctrine to match outcome, ensuring that obedience was always, in hindsight, the correct response. I could not unknow this. I could not close this text and forget what the old catechism said, and what the new catechism said, and what the difference between them meant. The knowledge was in me, permanent and heavy, and it changed the weight of every writ I signed and every cipher I applied, and every time I recited the litany of final mercy and believed that mercy was what I was performing. I closed the terminal. I returned to my lectern. I did not alter the records. I did not restore the original catechism. I did not flag the discrepancy for review. I did not resist. Obedience sustains the system precisely because it erases contradiction. I understood this now with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that does not illuminate but blinds. The system worked because people like me followed the procedure. Because we verified the seals and confirmed the authority and transcribed the record and did not ask why the catechism changed or where the appeals went or why recoverable worlds were reclassified as irrecoverable. Because we trusted the architecture and the architecture trusted our compliance, and together we produced the output that the crusade required. I was not a judge. I was not a moral agent. I was a component. And the horror of being a component was not that I had no choice, but that I did have a choice, and I made it every time I pressed my cipher to the seal and transmitted the order that killed another world. I chose compliance. I chose it because refusal meant reclassification. I chose it because doubt meant instability. I chose it because the only alternative to obedience was destruction. The same destruction I administered turned inward. I chose compliance, and compliance was not faith. Compliance was the absence of resistance. The two are not the same. I worked. The 32nd hour. 4 hours remained. The nutrient paste had been supplemented by a secondary stimulant dose, administered by the duty medicae during the mandatory physiological check that occurred at the 3/4 mark of every extended shift. The injection was delivered to the base of my neck, a cold pressure followed by a spreading warmth that sharpened my cognition and steadied my hands. The tremor ceased. My vision clarified. The narrowing of my mental channels reversed, briefly, producing a temporary expansion of awareness that was almost painful after the compressed focus of the preceding hours. I processed the final writs in the queue. 7 worlds, condemned. The seals were genuine. The authority was confirmed. The format was correct. I authenticated them with the mechanical precision that 41 years had grafted into my nervous system. Receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. The confirmation feeds came and went, vox signals rising and falling and finally ceasing, worlds dying in the time it took me to verify a signature and press a key. The sounds were familiar. The silence that followed was familiar. Everything was familiar, and the familiarity was the worst part. The way the extraordinary had been reduced to routine, the way the death of millions had been absorbed into the rhythm of receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. 7 worlds, complete, and then my terminal locked. The display froze mid-transaction, the amber runes halting in their cascade, the input keys becoming inert beneath my fingers. A new rune appeared at the center of the screen, one I had seen only in bureau training materials and never in active service. The internal audit flag, a crimson glyph that indicated my identification credentials, had been flagged for review by the Bureau's oversight apparatus. I waited. There was nothing else to do. The blast door at the far end of the nave cycled open. 2 figures entered. The first was Interrogator Sevrain, her black coat unchanged, her rosette gleaming at her throat. The second was a figure I did not recognize, a man in the crimson robes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his face obscured by a rebreather mask and optical enhancement lenses. his hands replaced by delicate mechadendrites that moved with the independent precision of living things. They approached my lectern together, their footsteps synchronized, and I felt the vault contract around me as if the cathedral architecture itself was narrowing to a point. "Senior Lex Mechanic Merenthos," Sevrain said. "You have been flagged for commendation." I said nothing. "Your processing output during this crusade cycle has exceeded baseline by 17%. Your compliance record is exemplary. Your adherence to the amended directive has been noted and approved. Crusade Command has selected you for cognitive streamlining." The Mechanicus adept stepped forward. His mechadendrites unfurled from beneath his robes, each one tipped with a different instrument: a data needle, an electroprobe, a microsurgical laser, a neural shunt. They arranged themselves in a pattern that I recognized from Bureau training materials, the configuration used for targeted memory excision. "Cognitive streamlining," Sevrain continued, her voice maintaining its calm, measured cadence, "is a supplementary service provided to high-performing administratum personnel during extended operational periods. The procedure addresses non-essential variance exposure, cognitive debris accumulated during intensive processing that may impede future efficiency. For optimal service, such material is categorized, isolated, and excised." Non-essential variance exposure. The contradictions I had found, the conflicting records, the altered catechism, the redacted appeals. The governor's voice citing an appeal number that no longer existed. The columns of figures that showed worlds being destroyed for economy rather than heresy, all of it categorized as debris, cognitive debris, material that impeded efficiency. The horror was not that they wanted to take my memories. The horror was that they were right. The knowledge I carried was an impediment. It slowed me. It produced hesitation, doubt, the flicker of moral awareness that the amended directive had been designed to eliminate. Without the knowledge, I would be faster, cleaner, more efficient, a better component. "The procedure requires your consent," Sevrain said. "Form 77 Alpha, Authorization for Elective Cognitive Maintenance. The form is on your lectern." It was. A single sheet of parchment, properly formatted, properly sealed, bearing my name and identification number and a description of the procedure in language so antiseptic that it could have described a dental examination. "Targeted excision of non-essential mnemonic variants accumulated during crusade cycle processing. No permanent cognitive impairment anticipated. Recovery period, 4 hours. Return to duty, immediate upon recovery certification. Refusal is, of course, your prerogative," Sevrain added. "However, refusal to undergo prescribed cognitive maintenance may indicate instability in a personnel asset assigned to the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. Such instability would necessitate a full psychological evaluation, suspension from duty pending review, and potential reassignment. Reassignment, like Cast, gone without trace, her lectern polished clean, her 14 years of service absorbed into the archive as if she had never stood there. I looked at the form. The parchment was crisp and white, fresh from the Bureau's own press. The ink was sharp and black. The language was clear. My name was there, printed in the standard typeface, and below it a line for my signature. I picked up the stylus. There was a moment in which I considered refusal. Not a long moment, not a dramatic internal struggle, just a brief acknowledgement of the possibility, the way one acknowledges the existence of a door that one passes without opening. Refusal was there. It existed as an option, but the option was not real. It was a formality, a legal fiction maintained to preserve the appearance of consent in a system that had already determined the outcome. If I refused, I would be evaluated. If I was evaluated, the knowledge I carried would be discovered. If the knowledge was discovered, I would be reclassified, not as heretic, not as traitor, simply as unstable. A malfunctioning component to be removed and replaced with the same administrative efficiency with which recoverable worlds were reclassified as irrecoverable. I signed the form. The Mechanicus adept guided me to a secondary chamber adjacent to the central vault, a small room that I had passed thousands of times without entering. It was white, clean. The walls were bare except for a mounted icon of the Omnissiah and a brass censer that burned a different incense than the vault, something sharper, more chemical, with an undertone of ozone that stung the back of my throat. A reclined chair occupied the center of the room, its surface padded with synth leather, its frame fitted with restraints that were described in the procedural documentation as stabilization assists. I sat. The restraints engaged, soft pressure at my wrists, ankles, and temples. The Mechanicus adept positioned himself behind my head, his mechadendrites arraying above me like the branches of a mechanical tree. Sevrain stood at the foot of the chair, her hands folded, her expression unchanged. "The procedure will take approximately 40 minutes, the adept said, his voice filtered through the rebreather into a flat monotone. "You may experience mild disorientation during the initial neural mapping phase. This is expected. Please remain still." I felt the first data needle enter at the base of my skull, a cold intrusion that bypassed pain and registered instead as pressure, a sense of something being inserted into the architecture of my mind. The second needle entered behind my left ear, the third above my right temple. Each one a point of entry, a doorway through which the adept's instruments would reach the specific neural clusters where the targeted memories were stored. The mapping phase began. I felt it as a kind of internal illumination, a light being shone into rooms I had not known existed, chambers of memory and association that were suddenly visible and categorized. The contradicting records, the altered catechism, the redacted appeals, the governor's voice, the columns of figures. Each memory was identified, tagged, isolated. Each one was designated as non-essential variants. Each one was cued for excision. The incense burned, the censer smoke drifted, the restraints held me still. I tried to hold on to the governor's voice. Aldon Vos. Appeal reference number Kappa Tertius 1144 Vos. I tried to fix the words in my mind, to anchor them against the methodical erasure that was approaching. But the mapping phase was precise, and I could feel the tagged memories becoming slippery, losing their connections to the broader network of my cognition, becoming isolated nodes that floated free of context and meaning. The excision began. It did not hurt. It felt like forgetting, not the natural forgetting of time and distance, the gradual fading that softens old memories into impressions. This was surgical, specific. I felt individual memories detach and dissolve, each one a distinct loss that I was aware of only for the instant before the awareness itself was removed. The contradicting records went first, then the altered catechism, then the redacted appeals, then the columns of figures. The governor's voice went last. I heard it one final time, calm and professional, citing the appeal reference number with the precision of a man who believed in the system he served. And then it was gone, and the space where it had been was smooth and empty, a cleaned surface in my mind where something had been inscribed and then wiped away. The needles withdrew, the restraints released. The incense continued to burn. "Procedure complete," the adept said. "Neural integrity confirmed. Cognitive function nominal. Return to duty in 4 hours." Sevrain leaned forward. "How do you feel, ex-mechanic?" I considered the question. I felt clear, focused. The fatigue of the extended shift had been partially addressed by the neural recalibration that accompanied the excision, a side effect of the procedure that the documentation described as incidental cognitive refreshment. My thoughts moved freely through their channels, unobstructed by the debris that had accumulated during the processing cycle. I could not recall what the debris had been. I knew, in an abstract sense, that something had been removed, the way one knows that a tooth has been extracted, even when the numbness prevents awareness of the gap. But the specifics were gone. The weight was gone. I feel efficient, interrogator. Excellent. I rested for 3 hours and 40 minutes. I slept briefly, a shallow unconsciousness that my body accepted with the mechanical gratitude of a machine receiving maintenance. When I woke, I ate nutrient paste. I washed my face in the lavatory adjacent to the rest chamber. I straightened my robes. I returned to my station. The central vault was exactly as I had left it. The servo skulls drifted in their patterns. The data looms whispered. The incense burned. The chronometer marked the final hour of the 36-hour shift, its brass hands approaching the completion point with the same steady indifference they had displayed throughout. My lectern was clean. The completed writs had been filed. The queue had been cleared during my absence by the automated processing system, which handled routine transmission tasks when Lex Mechanic stations were unoccupied. Only one item remained: the cracked obsidian data slate. It rested on the lectern's reading cradle, its surface dark and cool beneath the amber light. The sigil of Exterminatus Extremis was visible on its face, raised gold against black stone, familiar and correct. I looked at it and felt nothing. No unease, no recognition, no flicker of the disturbance that had accompanied my first contact with it at the beginning of the shift. It was a slate. It bore an order. I had authenticated the order. The record was sealed. I picked it up and placed it in the completed document tray for archival storage. The slot accepted it with a soft pneumatic hiss. The tray descended into the archive system. The slate was gone, absorbed into the permanent record, one entry among millions. A new writ appeared on my display, a new world designated for sanction. The seals were genuine. The authority chain was confirmed. The format was correct. I recited the litany of final mercy. The words came easily, automatically, shaped by decades of repetition into sounds that required no thought. By the authority vested in the servants of the Golden Throne, I receive this judgment. Let the record show that mercy was sought and mercy was spent. What remains is fire. Let fire be truth. Let truth be eternal. The Imperium endures. My hand did not tremble. My breath did not catch. My eyes did not stray to the columns of figures on the hololithic display, or the empty lectern beside mine, or the sealed lift to the lower archive tiers. I authenticated the order. I transmitted the confirmation. Somewhere, beyond the hull of the station, beyond the cold silence of the void, cyclonic torpedoes ignited. A world that had been alive became a world that was dead, and the transition from one state to the other was recorded with timestamps precise to the microsecond. I marked it complete. The data looms wove the record into the permanent archive. The servo skulls catalogued the entry. The incense burned. The chronometer completed its circuit. The shift ended. The next shift began. I remained at my station. There was always more work. There was always another writ, another world, another designation scrolling across the display in the clean amber light of the archive vault. The queue was never empty. The queue would never be empty. The Imperium spanned 1,000,000 worlds, and each one existed in a state of perpetual evaluation, perpetual judgment, perpetual proximity to the fire that waited at the end of every failure. My role was to ensure that the fire was properly documented, that the judgment was properly sealed, that the record was eternal. I performed my role. A junior adept brought me a new data slate. I received it with steady hands and set it on the reading cradle. The seals glowed in the amber light. The authorization was confirmed. The planetary designation was unfamiliar, a world I had never processed before, a name that carried no associations, no memories, no weight. I authenticated it. Receive, verify, authenticate, transmit. The rhythm was clean. The rhythm was efficient. The rhythm was all. I had been told once that there was a time before the Bureau, a time when the destruction of worlds was debated, contested, mourned, a time when exterminatus was genuinely the last resort, invoked with grief and sealed with tears. I could not remember who had told me this. I could not remember when. The knowledge existed in my mind as a fragment, a piece of context without a source, and I could not determine whether it was history or myth. It did not matter. The Bureau existed now, the protocols existed now, the queue existed now, and I existed within all of them, a component performing its function, a hand pressing a cipher, a voice reciting a litany. The archive was vast, the archive was eternal, the archive was the only record that would survive the death of every world it contained, the only proof that those worlds had existed at all. My work was not destruction, my work was preservation. I preserved the record of the Imperium's judgments, and the record was the Imperium, and the Imperium endured. This was enough. Another world, another writ, another seal, another cipher, another transmission, another silence where a planet had been. I did not think about the silence. There was nothing to think about. The silence was data. The silence was confirmation. The silence meant that the process had concluded successfully and the record could be sealed. The silence was not loss. The silence was completion. I was good at my work. I was efficient. I was compliant. I was precise. I no longer remembered what the cracked obsidian slate had meant to me, or why it had felt warm, or why the designation Kalish Tertius had once produced a hesitation that I could no longer define. The name was in the archive. The record was sealed. The world was gone. I felt nothing about this, and the nothing was comfortable, and the comfort was all I needed. The chronometer turned. The data looms whispered. The incense burned. The vault endured.